So we're in Romans again this morning, and we're in chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. And here's the big idea. Ignoring the truth about God is never going to leave you unchanged. Whenever you push God's truth aside, everything in your life is going to start to unravel. Spiritually, morally, relationally. I mean, we certainly see that in society today. Everything's unraveling. Why? They've pushed God aside. And Romans puts a spotlight on it. Romans doesn't simply diagnose the problem. Romans gets us to a place where we can actually appreciate the solution. I used to be in the golf business world, and I attended my first PGA merchandise show in Orlando in 1986. I was working for a guy named Mike Adams at Bloomington Country Club in Central Illinois, and Mike was one of the top, still is, top teachers in the world. And I was blown away, a little starstruck when I started working for him as an assistant golf pro, because all the PGA Tour players would come visit him and come take lessons, and would go out to dinner and go out to lunch with guys who just won on the tour and people who just won the U.S. Open. I remember going to the Milwaukee Open with him one time, and again, I'd never been exposed to any type of celebrity type person before, and certainly being a golfer, I looked up to these people, saw them on TV, and suddenly I'm out on the driving range with a pass where you could walk up and talk to them while they're hitting balls. We went out to a Milwaukee Brewers game, and a guy named Brad Faxon came with us to the Brewers game, one of the best players on the tour, and he's a commentator now, but just couldn't believe it. And we went down to the PGA Merchandise Show in January, which was nice to get out of the cold weather, and but when we arrived in town, it was unseasonably cold. It was only 24 degrees, so a little chilly. And then the next morning when we woke up, it was also very, very cold. Not a cloud in the sky. I'll never forget the day. The bluest, clearest sky you could ever imagine, but it was still about 36 degrees. And I'll never forget that time, and it's imprinted on me, because at 11:15 that morning, everybody walked out of the Orange County Convention Center to watch the space shuttle launch, where everything looked normal at first, and then it didn't. Something very, very wrong happened. The Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart just 73 seconds after launch. The investigation revealed that the engineers had warned that the O-rings don't perform well in cool weather. You got to be careful. We're not sure about them. We've never tested them at temperatures this low. And I think about that, and I'm like, well, you don't really have to even be a rocket scientist to know that rubber gets very hard when it's cold outside. So the information was given, and the danger should have been obvious, you would think. The warnings were sounded, but still 7 people lost their lives. My point? The tragedy wasn't caused by a lack of knowledge. It was caused by ignoring what was known. That's Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 is describing, if you will, a spiritual freeze. Paul is saying here that that humanity's been given evidence of God. We've been given evidence of God. But instead of responding to that truth, people suppress it. That means the primary issue here isn't ignorance, it's rejection. Now, the text this morning explains what happens when people exchange God's truth for something else. Now, I remember ignoring the engine warning light on my 1978 Olds Cutlass Supreme, the first car I ever had. It was actually a red light flashing at me. I was out of oil. It didn't end well for my Cutlass Supreme. I really wish I still had that. There are 4 main points this morning. Point number 1, God has made himself known. It reads like this. Romans 1:18, it reads, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who, by their unrighteousness," and here's that word, "suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." The King James Version reads like this: men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. It's interesting to me that Greek word that they're using for suppress would have been a word to describe a helmsman who's trying to steer a boat against a current. So it means a current wants to take a boat a certain way, but determined to go the opposite way, the helmsman holds or suppresses the rudder in such a way that he can go his way instead of the way the current wants to take him. That's what Paul is saying here. That's why he uses that word. The wrath of God is revealed against those who are determined to go their own way, regardless of what they know to be true. That is the genesis of unbelief. That's how it starts. It's point number 1 on our outline this morning. It reads like this: unbelief doesn't begin with a lack of evidence. The first step begins with the suppression of truth. That's how unbelief starts. The suppression of truth. The problem is not that God has hidden himself. In fact, it's that people reject what he's revealed. God has made himself known through the order and the beauty and the design of creation. This is what Paul is saying in verse 20. He's saying they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, because they've seen what he's created, the earth, the sky, everything God's made. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Paul's saying, look around you. It's there. Because creation points to its creator. Now, my brother Randy, he lives on the beach in Hollywood, not literally on the beach, but I've paced it off from his front door. It's 30 paces to the beach. And he goes out there every morning. It's kind of his thing. He'll have a cup of coffee. He likes to watch the sunrise. And he and my sister are in a chat group, and he always sends us text of the pictures. So these are pictures that he takes with his iPhone on a Hollywood beach. Here's the thing. When every sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean, every tide going in and out, every little creature scurrying across the sand, it points to a creator. You can't miss it. Nature shows us intellectually enough to know that there is a God. I mean, if somebody leaves their iPhone 17 back there by the coffee maker, we're not going to assume that just, you would never assume it assembled itself. It's too intricate of a design. Your eyeball is more complicated than an iPhone 17. Design points to a designer. Creation points to a creator. That's Psalm 19. It reads, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known." Verse 19 of Romans chapter 1 says this: "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." And that's why Paul says in verse 20, they are without excuse. Now, that's Napoleon. Napoleon often spoke of the universe as evidence of a creator. And it's well documented that he believed that the order of the cosmos was so complicated that it proves there absolutely is a God. And there's a quote that he's walking with a group of admirals. So admirals are out on the ocean a lot, and they see stars like we've never seen stars, especially back then. No ambient light. It must have been unbelievable. So he's walking with the admirals one evening, and they're discussing whether or not God exists. Napoleon is said to have pointed to the stars and said, "Sirs, if you're going to get rid of God, you have to get rid of these." Point number 2 this morning is the foolish exchange. And exchange is the key word in this section. It starts out in verse 21. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." You see, man inherently knows, we know there's a creator. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says we even have eternity written on our hearts. But they choose to suppress the truth and deny that God even exists. That's because if there is a God, they would be required to submit to him. But the flesh doesn't want to do that. So they'll ignore the truth that they see all around. They'll say God doesn't exist, even though the heavens and the stars say hey, yes, he does. The people knew God, but here's the point here. They refused to honor him, and they refused to thank him. And eventually, it says they exchanged God's glory for worthless idols. So point number 2, spiritual decline starts with ingratitude. They stop thanking God. A heart that stops thanking God, eventually, well, it'll drift from God. It drifts from God. And I believe that's why the writer of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 2:4. So we must listen very carefully to the truth we've heard, or we may drift away from it. Now, it's the same today, actually. We live in a world full of idols. We don't necessarily have the statues of birds in our house and things like that, although some may. But we live in a world filled with idols because anything that takes the place of God becomes an idol. So anything that keeps you from worshiping the Lord becomes an idol. And that could be things like success, a job, money, position, power, sports, comfort, sex. Whatever sits on the throne of your heart determines the direction of your life. Verse 22 says that they claimed to be wise. The NLT reads like this: claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. So that's point number 3. The second step of unbelief is twisting the truth to fit our own desires. Twisting the truth to fit our own desires. The third point this morning is this, point number 3. God gives people over to their choices. This phrase, God gave them up, he's going to use it 4 times in this section of Scripture. In verse 24, he says, therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Point number 4, the third step of unbelief, then, is the perversion of life. It's the perversion of life. They dishonored their bodies amongst themselves. And then it goes on in verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. There are 3 dimensions of depravity, and this is the first. Sensual depravity. Point number 5. The depravity of man. God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Please take note of what it doesn't say. Because it says God gave them up, like I said, 4 times. It does not say that God forced them into sin. It doesn't say that. It simply says he allowed them to pursue what they had chosen. It's like a parent continually warning a rebellious teenager, hey, don't go down that road. Eventually, the parent may say, if that's what you insist on choosing, I'm going to let you experience the consequences. That's what God's doing here. That's the idea. Here's point number 4. Sin always expands beyond the original choice. And Paul ends chapter 1 with a long list of sins, and it's broad. Verse 28 says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. I mean, I think he broke off the tip of his pencil on this one. Here's the point he's making. Rebellion against God affects every area of your life. And there's envy and there's gossip and things that we do, slander, arrogance, disobedience, a complete lack of mercy. It's like this, and please don't miss this point. Sin never stays contained to just one sin. It's like a crack in your windshield, and it spreads. It says in verse 28 that God gave them up to a depraved mind. In the NIV, it reads like this: "Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done." So the first dimension of depravity then is mental, because he says he gave them over to a depraved mind. It's mental. The second dimension, point number 6, is a depravity is mental. Mental. The first dimension is sensual. The second dimension is mental. Now our final verse, verse 32. It reads like this: "Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, even though they know if they do it, they deserve to die, they continue to not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." So it ends with a frightening progression here in chapter 1. He says eventually we don't just practice what's wrong, we actually celebrate it. We begin to approve of it. Think about what we watch on TV, right? I mean, if a married friend said to you, "Hey, can you go out to coffee with me after the Bible study?" And then you go out to coffee with him and he goes, "Hey, I just want you to know I'm having an affair." You wouldn't say to him, "Hey, good for you. That's awesome, man." No, you would say to him, "Hey, dude, that's not going to end well. Let me explain what's going to happen. And it's going to happen fast." You wouldn't let him do it. But essentially, you put the same story on a movie screen and you give it a compelling storyline and 2 attractive actors maybe, and we can suddenly find ourselves rooting for the 2 people that end up together, even though one of them is married. Or you think about revenge. If one of your buddies tells you, "Hey, that person hurt me that I work with and I'm going to destroy them," you'd tell them, "Hey, that's wrong, man. You're going to end up losing his job and your job, and it's going to destroy your life. You got to leave that alone." You wouldn't let them do that. You'd intervene. But put revenge at the center of a 2-hour action movie, like the movie Taken, and we'll spend the entire 120 minutes hoping they get even. And you might even go to work the next day and tell your friends about it. "Hey, this action movie's fantastic, man. It's just nonstop from beginning to end." That's the question verse 32 forces us to confront. Have I become entertained by something God said should grieve me? Have we learned to applaud and promote what happens on the screen, which we would condemn in real life? And that's a struggle. Because verse 32 says they give approval to those who practice them. This is the point where participation becomes celebration. The King James Version reads like this: "Who, knowing the judgment of God, that which they commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them." Therefore, point number 7, the third and ultimate dimension of depravity is the celebration of sin. Because it says they have pleasure in them that do them. That's the final step. Letter A, culture doesn't always convince us that sin is right. Sometimes it simply teaches us to applaud what we once knew was wrong. And you might think, "Well, I've read through a lot of those things. I would never murder anyone. I would never do something like that." Well, you might with your mouth. You might murder them with your words. And again, like I said, we enjoy watching dramas and things that have murder in them. We'll even tune in maybe and watch the Emmys or Academy Awards and watch somebody get a trophy for doing it. That is the very definition of having pleasure in them that do it. You're letting your carnal appetite be developed. And hey guys, we're visual. You got to be careful. Whatever you put in your eyes stays in your brain. You have to be very careful of that. So here's the progression. Paul lays it all out in chapter 1. First, the truth about God is suppressed. Then, worship is perverted. He says God is replaced with idols. You have to be careful you don't have an idol in your life. Finally, human life is perverted. People become distorted by sin. It's a vicious downward spiral that begins with rejecting God and then replacing God, and it ends up with us ruining ourselves. Because when we stop worshiping the Creator, we begin worshiping the created. And Paul pointed out, hey, you're without excuse. You know. And God allows men and women to go down as far as they desire. He'll let us crash. Sometimes maybe to draw us close to Him. Sometimes maybe we crash and God's going to use you to help somebody else prevent that from happening. But God's going to allow it. And it's all going to work out for His good. Here's the application. Paul listed a bunch of individual sins, right? None are worse than the other. We had a guy in our group last night say, you know, that in God's economy, stealing a toothpick is the same as stealing a truckload of lumber. It's the same. None are worse than the other. But the issue is much bigger, right? But let me restate that. No sin is worse than the other. Jesus made it very clear. He told the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke chapter 18. And as we read through this story, you have to remember the guy that wrote Romans, Paul, was a Pharisee. He was a religious zealot. He tried to follow every single law in the Old Testament. And he looked down on other people that weren't. And this is what Jesus said, because the Pharisee was convinced of his own righteousness, because he thought so highly of himself that he looked down on other people. And so Jesus said this in Luke chapter 18. He said, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer. I thank you, God, that I'm not like other people, cheaters and sinners and adulterers. I'm certainly not like that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week and I give you 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even to lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, "O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." And Jesus said, I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. The real issue then is the human heart. And that is exactly where Romans is heading. It's almost depressing reading through this first chapter, but it gets better. Hang on. And I think Paul's preparing us for Romans chapter 3 here, because it says in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, for everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. No one escapes the diagnosis. Everyone needs the gospel. No one is righteous, not one person. Now, I had stomach surgery back in June. I'm all fixed up, good as new. First part of June was a little bit of a rough ride. The reason they found out something was wrong with my stomach, though, started out because I had a chest cold, and I went into a clinic, and they took an x-ray of my chest and found out something was wrong with my stomach. And that struck me because that's Romans chapter 1. Romans is the x-ray that reveals the disease before the rest of Romans reveals the cure. Here's what Romans 1 teaches. God has revealed himself, and humanity has suppressed that truth. In fact, people exchange God's truth for substitutes. And number 3, the goal of Romans 1 is not to help us identify other people's sins. That's not why he's listing them. The goal is to help us recognize humanity's need for a Savior. Now, the AAA Foundation did a study. You know what they found? Over 500 people die every year from driving the wrong way on the highway. 500 people. From 2014 to 2023, there were 5,730 fatalities. That's an average of 573 people a year die on the highways from driving the wrong way. Now, a few years ago, a driver entered a major interstate using the exit ramp. As he drove, other motorists were flashing their headlights, and they were honking and trying to get his attention. And he became frustrated, thinking, why is everyone driving the wrong direction? The problem wasn't that he lacked information. The do not enter signs were clearly there on the exit ramp. The arrows were there. The warning lights were there. Yet a driver can be so disoriented that he truly believes everyone else is going the wrong direction. That's pretty much Romans chapter 1, except it's a spiritual condition. My wife and I marvel that somehow people are now okay with men playing sports against high school, college, and professional athletes, that men can play against women. And yet, it's a perfect example of what's going on. We've been watching the WNBA, following Sophie Cunningham and all that saga. That's an example of the wrong way driving in Romans chapter 1. When people suppress God's truth long enough, they don't merely reject it. No, they eventually become convinced that what is right is wrong, and what is wrong is right. Final point. The further people move from God, the more distorted their thinking becomes. Eventually, they don't merely reject the truth, they redefine the truth. If you reject God's truth long enough, you can become so deceived that wrong begins to look right and right begins to look wrong. And listen, we've been warned. It's Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, and it reads like this: Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them. I think that means judgment's coming.